Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I was told we better start to avoid further delays down the road. I suppose all of you will receive the slides later on, so also those who will be arriving a bit later will see them. Good morning. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you. Given your background and future role with the Indian Forest Service, I decided to focus this presentation on forest biodiversity to focus on recent FAO work on biodiversity, which goes a little bit to the corporate level and focuses on mainstreaming biodiversity across sectors. So after a brief introduction about forests and biodiversity in our work, FAO Forestry's work on it, I will briefly present our just launched State of the World's Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture, not only because this is a valuable reference document per se, which I think deserves to be brought to your attention, but also because it's an important source for this whole work on mainstreaming biodiversity across sectors. Now, let's start with the definition. Biodiversity, we understand, is the variety of life at genetic, species, and ecosystem level. So for us, that is very important, FAO, that we look at the three dimensions of biodiversity. Now, coming to forests, forests are home to, as we know, of over 80% of the terrestrial biodiversity. And biodiversity also constitutes a well-recognized element of forestry. It is explicitly recognized in the Sustainable Forest Management concept and then also in the UN Strategic Plan for Forests. And also other sectors actually also recognize the importance of forest biodiversity, such as the related discussions of the Committee on World Food Security. Now, relevant FAO works includes our work on forest genetic resources, which Jarkko Koskela will present later on this morning. It includes the wildlife and protected areas work, which was presented yesterday by Christina Rodina, and also other work streams in the division include biodiversity, and I'm just naming some of them. And for your interest is also that the Global Forest Resources Assessment has important variables related to biodiversity, and I understand the presentation will follow later on, not only on biodiversity, but more general about this, about the FRA, which I think is important. Also for your information that we provide technical advice and support to regional and global processes related to biodiversity, and we are, for example, currently contributing to the ongoing discussions on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework that is expected to be adopted at the next conference of the parties to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity in China next year. Now, coming to the state of the world's biodiversity for food and agriculture, I have here a couple of copies of the short briefs and one display copy of the whole document. I suggest to hand it out later on. Now, the background to this report, which we consider a very important one, was that it was mandated in 2007 by the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. And further to that mandate, FAO prepared this first global assessment of the state and trends of biodiversity of food and agriculture. It was a 5-year process, and it was finally launched this year in February. Now, what does it mean, biodiversity for food and agriculture? We understand it as it's a subset of biodiversity, and it's the variety of life at genetic, species, and ecosystem levels that contribute to agriculture and food production. In that brief that I will hand out later on, and they're all also available on the internet, you can see the different dimensions. You can look at them in more calmly later on if you're interested. Now, let's focus now on the key findings of the report. There are 5 of them. First of them is that biodiversity is essential to food and agriculture. This is not a surprise. I should say that in FAO terms, agriculture is understood as comprising agriculture, forestry, and fishery. So that's always encompassing forestry. So biodiversity being essential for food and agriculture is not a surprise for foresters. We do know that. Secondly, biodiversity for food and agriculture is declining. And I mean, that is also consistent with the global data on the state of biodiversity per se. And of course, that thirdly, multiple interacting drivers of change are affecting those. And among those, the driver that really came out of the country reports and of this analysis was the changes in land and water use and management. So I think that's important, and I think that's also where forestry can take into account. Now, the fourth key finding here was on the more positive twist of things in the backdrop that everything is declining, is that the use of many biodiversity-friendly practices is reported to be increasing. And I highlighted with the red arrows those related to forestry, which relates to naturally regenerated forest and planted forest as being the production systems, and then the different management practices, you see them to the left. They're all having a rather positive trend. And indeed, citing data from FAO's Global Forest Resources Assessment, the global area under forest management plans has increased steadily since the 1990s, reaching 2.1 billion in 2010. And of these, and in these forest management plans, increasingly we see that they integrate a wide range of management practices associated with the multiple benefits of forests, so leaving room, integrating biodiversity. And we also, or the Global Forest Resources Assessment also finds that forests designated primarily for biodiversity conservation accounts for 13% of the world's forest area, with the largest area reported in the US and Brazil. Now, the fifth finding of that report is that still the enabling frameworks for the sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity for food and agriculture remain insufficient and need to be strengthened, established, or strengthened. And important elements here are the legal, policy, and institutional frameworks, cross-sectoral coordination, and multi-stakeholder engagement, just to name a few. Now, this brings me to the second, or even the part of this presentation, which is about the mainstreaming of biodiversity across agriculture sectors. Now, this work and the importance of having a more cross-sectoral view of things was a process over the last 5 years. In parallel, in 2016, in the face of the fact that the importance of biodiversity mainstreaming was gaining increasing attention, the 2016 UN Biodiversity Conference called for the mainstreaming of biodiversity across agricultural sectors, and again, agricultural sectors comprising forestry and fisheries. And at that time, FAO proposed, and the UN Biodiversity Conference welcomed, FAO's initiative to act as biodiversity mainstreaming platform. And I think that platform is important to bring to your attention as you go back then to India to exercise your duties. Now, what does it mean, mainstreaming biodiversity? In fact, it has been interpreted in many ways. And one useful definition is that of the Global Environment Facility, which describes it as written there, the process of embedding biodiversity considerations into policies, strategies, and practices of key public and private actors that impact or rely on biodiversity so that it is conserved and sustainably and equitably used both locally and globally. Now, the aim of the biodiversity mainstreaming platform is to improve the cross-sectoral coordination of policies and practices to mainstream biodiversity across agricultural sectors. And this is, of course, in line with what was coming out of this report as well. The cross-sectoral coordination is a key issue. A first activity of that platform was to hold informal multi-stakeholder dialogue in Rome last year, which was bringing together the environment and agricultural sector. So it's not only to have a cross-sectoral approach between agriculture, forestry and fisheries, but also between agriculture and the environmental sector. Since then, and a follow-up, since then the same topic was discussed in our relevant technical committees. I trust that yesterday you received an overview of how FAO is structured and how we get our guidance from member countries through the technical committees. So it was also endorsed by our technical committee, the Committee on Forestry. And since then, what happened was that, on the one hand, regional dialogues were initiated. The first one in Latin America took place in October last year in Mexico. The one in Asia is scheduled to take place in Thailand in July this year. And if you're interested, I'm happy to liaise to send you more information to that as soon as the concept note becomes available. And then for Africa, the one is scheduled for the second half of this year. So regional dialogues is one specific follow-up to have a more regional, specific discussion what mainstreaming biodiversity across agriculture means. And then secondly, we were mandated, or FAO was asked to develop a FAO strategy on mainstreaming biodiversity across sectors. And that is currently under development and expected to be presented to the next session of the FAO conference in June this year. Now, mainstreaming biodiversity in forestry, what does it mean? In the face of the well-established concept that we have in forestry of the sustainable forest management, the question arises about the meaning of it for us. At first glance, it can appear that it simply means upscaling the actual implementation of SFM, of sustainable forest management on the ground. And that possibly complemented by additional improvements of biodiversity management in sustainable forest management policies and practices. So that's important, that we do our homework in our sector. That's important that we look at and increase the integration of biodiversity consideration. But it's not only that. The aim of the platform and our aim is to also look increasingly on the interface between forestry and the other sectors, agricultural sectors, agriculture and fisheries. So not only look at the interconnections across the sectors, but then also look at the connection between agriculture and environment, the other sector. For example, forests can provide important habitat for pollinators, for nearby agricultural fields, and thereby play an important role for sustainable agricultural production. So there's a real cross-sectoral linkage, and if you really want to seize these forest benefits for agriculture, you need to work together. Those two sectors need to work together, and ideally also the environment sector, which may be then more concerned with the pollinators as being one of the biodiversity components. Now, cross-sectoral collaboration being essential, and indeed the sustainable forest management concept does recognize some of the cross-sectoral linkages. However, there's room to improve in the implementation. That's what we see, the contribution of forest biodiversity to agriculture and fisheries. And in this context, an integrated approach across landscapes, sometimes also named as the landscape approach, appears useful to determine the benefits of forest biodiversity for the other sectors, and then to identify key threats and appropriate responses. So what are the drivers that drive the loss of forest biodiversity, and what are appropriate measures? And then very often we need to work with our colleagues from the other sectors to see how best to address those. I mean, a key element here is always that we know that a lot of forest biodiversity, that forests contain, host a lot of biodiversity, and yet forests are under threat by agricultural expansion and others. So we need to work together to address the conservation, sustainable use of forest biodiversity. Useful starting points to further elaborate on that are one of global reports, knowledge products such as those developed by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, Not sure if you've heard about that, but that's one. But then, of course, also the different FAO State of the World reports, such as the more comprehensive one. We have sectoral ones for example, the State of the World of Forest. The next one is expected to be on forest and biodiversity. So these ones are more sector-specific, but the more intersectoral one is that one where I will give you and hand out some briefs later on. But in this context, it's important to not only look at the conservation aspect of biodiversity, but also be sensitive to the sustainable use element of biodiversity. And it is important to be aware of possible trade-offs of the different dimensions of biodiversity. I mentioned the genetic, species, and ecosystem dimension. Sometimes we focus only at ecosystem level and we take it for granted that then the species level it will all be fine, but there may be trade-offs, and I think it's important to be aware of those and manage those. And it is important to address the drivers of forest loss together with the other sectors. Now, what opportunities does this offer for us? Well, it offers for, starting with our member countries or countries' governments. On the one hand, through the platform now, it offers an opportunity for exchange on the opportunities for biodiversity mainstreaming. It's phrased it a little bit dual, but you know what I'm meaning, to exchange on what could be interesting entry points and are the best or good practices to be learned from each other. The regional level might be interesting because of a similar context. For you to then, and for the sector to identify, do our homework first, check in our sectors, how can we improve biodiversity mainstreaming in our sectors, looking at the guidelines, and this is also on us then later on FAO. Look what we can do better in our sector, but then also, and that's maybe the more novel element, look at across sectors, what can be useful entry points to better and promote biodiversity mainstreaming across agricultural sectors, given the fact that globally biodiversity is still declining, even though it's so important. Now, knowledge management and learning, whether in the form of compiling good practices, lessons learned, testing alternative methods, etc., has the potential to further improve and upscale initiatives for biodiversity mainstreaming, and this is where we come in as well, and we see as FAO and with partners that we can work on promoting the knowledge management and learning, and address emerging data gaps that may arise. In fact, now at our level, and I'm glad to see Damien Bertrand sitting also in the audience, we are in the process of establishing new work. One is related to forest management and pollination, exactly for that link, and to see how forest management practices could be improved to enhance pollination services. And the other is to revisit our work on human-wildlife conflict, for example, to have a stronger consideration of this the need for cross-sectoral coordination, and I trust Christina Olina mentioned that yesterday in her presentation to you. And then last for you to know is a teaser for next year to expect. As you may know, we have at FAO Forestry, we have one flagship publication, which is the State of the World's Forest. And the next edition is due next year in 2020, which is expected to focus on forest biodiversity and people. All this also considering that we have a lot of biodiversity discussions going on also globally with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to be concluded, hopefully, in China next year. So thank you very much for your attention. I think there was a brief overview from my side, and I'm now looking forward to your question. This was a more general overview of our corporate activities, not specific to India, but I trust my colleague later on will have much more India and region-specific examples for you that maybe also reflect on the topic we've just discussed. Thank you very much.
Please, one or two comments in the row, and then Sheila would.
Sure. I should give them all this one.
A very good morning, ma'am. I'm Saurabh Singh Thakur from Indian Forest Service. And my question is this, that how the BT crops promoted by global giants like Monsanto, Syngenta, and DuPont, they are impacting the biodiversity in food and agriculture, and how you are planning to deal with it?
Thank you. That's a very good question and a difficult one. I mean, us at our level at FAO, in FAO Forestry, we are limited to the forest sector. This is a very good question, and we need to discuss it further with our colleagues in agriculture. I need to defer to them, but this is the kind of discussions we need to have, because we also see that that is one, but also the use of pesticides, for example, is affecting pollinators, and then again it has feedback loops with forestry. So we need to have an open discussion with them. But at this stage, I would say we have to discuss with our colleagues in agriculture. But this is exactly the type of discussions we need to have, these cross-sectoral discussions, yeah. Thank you. And I hope you will do that also in India when you are in service then. Please.
Any further from your side?
I don't understand.
Ma'am, if we see agriculture from historical perspective, then agriculture is a selection of superior variety, a selection of superior species, which ultimately lead to reduction of biodiversity. And when we link agriculture with forestry, then the output is agroforestry, which have also selection of some species which are for human utility, which is also lead to reduction of biodiversity. So do you think that there is linkage of agriculture and forestry needed, or we should promote forestry in a natural way?
Okay, maybe the last, I understood that you mentioned that the linkages between agriculture and forestry could be through agroforestry. You mentioned selection of species, and then I missed the last.
If we go for linkage between agriculture and forestry, this will ultimately lead to reduction of biodiversity, because forests should be promoted as a nature if we see forestry from biodiversity perspective.
Okay, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I hope my answer will respond to your question. We face the issue of trade-offs. We need to face the issue of trade-offs. That for sure. So I think it's from my perspective, it's a way of finding more efficient use of biodiversity. And if there are negative trade-offs, that we try to limit those and manage those. I'm not sure if this is what. I mean, it's difficult to entirely preserve and say that we do not touch forests at all in order to maintain biodiversity. This is what I meant to say about the sustainable use aspect. So we have to find ways, and that's the tricky, actually the most tricky question, to find appropriate management responses or approaches that balance that. And we need to be realistic and take into account that in some cases it may mean a certain reduction, but let's try to make that minimal, let's try to reduce that negative trade-off. I think that's the core element.
If no further question come in, I would add to the last comment that if a glass is half full or half empty, it's the same objectively, but it looks different. And this continuous term, biodiversity loss, is not a natural science term, it's a social science term. That burdens a minority of society with the preservation of biodiversity, where the rest of society can accuse them. And very especially, we have a single situation where the convention in certain ways sets standards that others have to deliver. Normally it doesn't work like this. It's a company that sets standards for himself. So eventually we have to start thinking about the glass half full. The people keeping forests, keeping rural areas are the guardians, the stewardship of biodiversity, and should be recognized. And eventually things work in a different manner than when you're always accusing them to lose biodiversity in a run that you're always going to lose. I mean, there is a certain purpose governance issue behind it. See it just from the other side, from the rural population. Instead of recognizing, it's always punishing. But those who punish, have they done anything? So I think we lack a lot of sociology and rural psychology in dealing with issues. It's important. And then there is also fashions. Putting you in Europe, there is the big fashion here now of the dark forest, of uneven age tracks and so on. But we are losing pollinators. Eventually, some new articles will come and say, no, we need clear cuttings, controlled clear cuttings, we have more flowering species and more biodiversity. We have the genetic that will come later, genetic biodiversity that is not seen. So at the end, we need to have also operational tools that can say what is more important, what is now in fashion. And I insisted you on this big ship that forest is, or we have to think about the overall picture. We have to think about the fires as well, so we have to integrate about water, about livelihoods. So it's important that we keep, we don't simplify issues that are complex and try to find, with the best knowledge,